This is a program I've been wanting to do on alternative views for 17 years, and that is have an interview with former CIA officer Phil Agee. Now, we have had some programs with Phil. You have seen some speeches that he has given that we've had copies of and have presented them to you, and on the documentary on company business. But this is our first chance to actually talk with him in person. Phil was in the CIA for 12 years and then quit after he saw what the CIA was actually doing, all the terrible things doing in the areas where he was working, particularly in Ecuador, Mexico, and Uruguay. He resigned in 1969 to write his first big book, Inside the Company, or CIA Diary. Since then, he's written 5 books, the last one being On the Run, which tells about his experiences after he got out of the CIA, when he was in Europe and trying to write his book, and the CIA was hounding him from country to country, doing everything it could to keep him from writing this book. Well, Phil, we're so pleased that you can finally be with us.
I'm very happy to be here. Very happy to be here.
You've had such an association with the CIA, both positive and negative, for so many years. Let's start out by talking about where the CIA is today. They say they want to do intelligence gathering on economic subjects rather than political, etc., like they had in the past. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that that's a normal activity. They've been doing that since the beginning. To speak of it as something new is really inaccurate. In this context of all this talk about economic and financial and commercial intelligence collection as a new role for the agency, I got out a document which was sent to me anonymously in 1976, 20 years ago practically. And this document was the list of the what they call key intelligence questions for 1975 in this very field, economic, commercial, financial intelligence, also high-tech developments, and all in the developed countries, all in allies like the NATO allies and Japan. And this was an innovation of William Colby when he came into the CIA in 1973. He tried to systematize and organize the foreign intelligence collection process. And for 1975, there were, I think, 69 key intelligence questions. And these are actually questions with some detail, and then there's a whole discussion of them that follows from 1 to 69. But these were only, on this document, they were only the 9 which deal with economic and commercial and financial matters. And I got that out, and it calls for great detail on all of these matters, including the negotiating positions, the fallback positions on such negotiations as the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, now the WTO. And all of it was, in its most important parts, spying on allies. And the State Department was supposed to get this type of information. The CIA would get it in its way, secretly, or through some kind of technical means, or through agents. And so I just point that document out. That's 20 years ago, and they were doing it for 20 years before that.
I would assume then they would turn this information over to the corporations, the multinational corporations?
That I can't be sure of. They would send it in, of course, to the analysts, and they would then be preparing reports for use within the government, in the Commerce Department, you know, and within the White House and the National Security Council and its staff. But the decision to turn it over to commercial companies or multinationals is something which I can't really say that they did that then, but we did help the multinationals in different ways from time to time. My very first job in the CIA after the training program was to, I was assigned to the Latin American division, to the Venezuela desk, and my job, it was so boring, I had to do name checks. And a name check is where you get a name from, in this case, Caracas, our office in Caracas in the embassy. And you make a request for all the records on this particular person from the Records Integration Division, or RID. That's where the files were. And then you were looking for anything negative, politically negative, in other words, or derogatory. It happened that these lists of names that I was getting every week were given to us in Caracas by the Chief of Security of Creole Petroleum.
Oh.
And Creole Petroleum, you know, was the largest overseas subsidiary of Esso, or now Exxon, of Standard Oil of New Jersey, in other words. And so we were performing this security check in order to help them keep political undesirables out of employment, because these were people who were prospective employees for Creole. And so we were doing these checks on Venezuelans, actually, and serving the interests of this enormous Standard Oil, Exxon, Esso subsidiary abroad. This is one example, and I can tell you, when I got out of that job, I was very happy, because it's just boring, as you can imagine, to try to go through all these different records and look for something that might be derogatory and then have to write it back. And the first name I got was Jose Diaz, and didn't even have a date of birth. So you can imagine how many files I had on Jose Diaz. It's the most common
like
name
John
in
Smith.
life. Of course, yeah. It was.
Well, this is when they say they're going to start doing economic intelligence now and helping out the quote U.S. unquote corporations. They've really been doing that all along. It's just kind of taking the mask off of it, because everywhere they have, the CIA has actually been making that particular country safe and profitable for the multinational corporations and local elites.
Yes, everything goes back to that. And as a matter of fact, this intervention abroad for stability, for the optimum operating conditions for U.S.-based multinationals, is something that predates even certainly World War II. And in some respects, you could say it even predates the Bolshevik Revolution, because it's more than 100 years now that the leadership in this country has understood that there's no way to preserve the system in this country without foreign markets for surplus production, without foreign labor, cheap labor, and without the cheapest possible natural resources. And this is something which has been going on for 100 years, all through the Cold War. And so it is something that's going to continue for the future. But in this economic and commercial area, there have been 2 cases this year of operations that went bad. One was in France in February, when the French government caught the CIA trying to recruit people in the French government for secret information on French negotiating positions within the World Trade Organization context. And they ordered 5 CIA people out of the country. That was the news at that time in February. 4 of them, including the chief of station, were in the embassy undercover as diplomats, you know. And then there was a 5th one, a woman who was outside the embassy. She was under some non-official cover. I don't know what that was, but that was the news at that time. And then it comes out much later, just a few weeks ago, that as a result of this and of the reaction of the French government, the strong reaction to this attempt to penetrate their government, the whole CIA operation in Paris, in France, was shut down, including whatever they were doing against international terrorism, the narcotics trade, and so forth. That's one case that went bad on them this year. Another one that went bad just a few weeks ago was the leakage to the press, which was eventually confirmed. It's true. The CIA was spying on the Japanese negotiators last summer in the trade, the auto talks. You know, how we're trying to get into their market and so forth. And the CIA was monitoring the communications, I believe, of the Japanese negotiators and the appropriate ministry, and also the companies themselves, so that our side, that's the Mickey Cantor side, would have a better knowledge of what they would accept and what they wouldn't accept. And so this has soured relations with Japan also. So when you get into this area of spying on your allies, you're asking for a lot of trouble. And whether they give that to the companies or not, it's difficult to say. I can't tell you.
Of course, they've been doing this type, we talk about the Japanese, they've been doing that type of monitoring of communications and for years, for decades. This is nothing new. I guess it just now came out.
Yes, and as I mentioned, it goes back at least 20 years, and then 20 years before that. But one area that ought not to be forgotten is Cuba, because there is a 35-year economic blockade going against Cuba still. And there are those people who are trying to intensify this and broaden it still more now. The CIA, without the slightest doubt, has the requirement in every country to report on any possible trade deals that Cuba may be interested in making, or investment in Cuba now that the country has opened up. And the CIA has got to collect this information so that measures can be taken to sabotage these possible deals of interest and benefit to Cuba. I was there last year, and I was in a meeting being addressed by Roberto Robaina. He is the foreign minister, very young, hip guy. And he was telling us that of every 10 possible deals they have for investment in Cuba or for trade, and the United States is able to squash 9. And so they know perfectly well that every move they make as they go around the world in trade negotiations or in seeking investment for whatever in Cuba, they are being followed and watched under a microscope so that some measure can be taken. It could be the ambassador with the local government. It could be any way they can approach the person and put the pressure on. There's a good example of this, for example. The Soviets built a large petroleum refinery very near Cienfuegos, which is the main city on the south coast. This was never put into operation before the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then there was a diminution in trade, and the Cubans finally convinced or made a deal with the Ecuadorians, which are one of the principal exporting countries, and they were to bring the petroleum from Ecuador to Cuba to this refinery, refine the products, and re-export, leaving behind a certain amount of production to pay for the use of the refinery. This was going to be a great deal for Cuba because they have an energy crisis that's terrible. The United States was able to put the fist down on Ecuador, and it fell through. So the Cubans made a deal with the Venezuelans, because eventually, you know, they nationalized Creole, and it's all a national industry now. The Venezuelans then were going to bring the petroleum to this refinery and re-export, leaving surplus production behind for the Cubans. The same thing happened. Bang. The Venezuelans had to withdraw. So the Cubans went to the Mexicans, and the Mexicans resisted. And now they are putting it into operation. So it's not hopeless, but you see how the United States is going around in these areas of economics and of trade and of commerce and finance to try to make the Cuban people suffer as much as they can. And this is affecting, in a drastic way, very young children and infants, and also the older, in other words, the most vulnerable. And it is an eternal shame on the United States, in my opinion, that we would do such a thing to an entire country, just because we don't like the system, just because they won't come under our protection, basically. It's a kind of a mafia attitude, and it has been that way since Eisenhower.
Well, that's capitalism.
Well, it's also the United States, and our tradition of being very nervous when we don't control something. And when a country like Cuba slips out from under our control, after we had ruled it practically as a neo-colony or a protectorate for 59 years or so, then it makes people nervous, because they know that if the Cubans are successful in their example of being able to provide, as a poor country, the best medical care in the third world to the whole population, because it's an inclusionary system. It's not like we have here, where you have this huge bulk of the population, you know, marginalized. But there, if everybody can have adequate medical care, if the schooling is adequate for all, and remember, Cuba has more doctors and more teachers per capita than any country in the world, and they have succeeded in these areas, and it's all state supported, which means people don't have to put money out for the medical care or for they of course pay the cost indirectly as a whole society, but they don't have to pay the bill in the hospital and so forth. And so that cannot be allowed to stand. It's a very bad example for the United States and for all the third world people in the United States. After all, we're becoming a third world country very fast, if not already, you know.
Not already, yeah.
And so there is a very large mass of people out there who can look at Cuba and say, well, if they can do it, and on a per capita income of $2,000, $2,500 a year, where ours is $22,500 a year, what's wrong with What's wrong with our system? I mean, maybe we ought to consider an alternative.
That's why Nicaragua, Sandinista Nicaragua, had to be destroyed.
Exactly. They were a bad example, and that's why Grenada had to be destroyed, because any movement that comes to power with the idea of providing for all the people and of escaping the control of the United States and its economy, let's say the corporations and so forth, then that is bad news here in the United States in the upper circles of power and influence. And so in Nicaragua, I watched it from the very beginning. I was often there, and it was a very sad sight to see the hopes at the beginning and the euphoria with the overthrow of this U.S. installed dictatorship from the 30s on, Somoza, and all the hopes for expanding education and the literacy program they adopted right at the beginning. It's similar to what the Cubans did.
Health as well.
Health as well, all of those things. Cuban doctors were in there. They were setting up clinics all over. The international solidarity movement was just tremendous for Nicaragua in those early years. And naturally, the United States could not let that stand.
And the economic system was working. They had the highest, greatest expansion of their gross national product of any country in the Western Hemisphere at that time.
That's right. That was in the early years. But then, you know, the CIA started to reorganize using Argentine military officers who had worked in this really... it's hard to find words for the Argentines, you know, in the 70s, the dirty war there. But these military people from Argentina were taken by the CIA, put to work in Honduras, reorganizing the remnants of the Somoza National Guard. And then it became a huge terrorist operation. And as a matter of fact, by the end, when the killing was stopping in the late 1980s, they had killed something like 35,000 people. And that's 1% of the population of Nicaragua. The comparable figure for the United States would be, what, 2.5 million people killed over an 8 to 9 year period. I mean, that's more than were killed in all the wars that the United States ever fought. I checked it out once. And it would be a catastrophe. Can you imagine if something happened to this country where 2.5 million people were killed? Well, it means in Nicaragua there's not a family that was untouched. I mean, and they have a huge number of amputees now in Nicaragua, and a very large program for getting prosthetics for these people because of the landmines that the countries put around. And they still haven't gotten them all out of the ground.
Same thing happened in Angola.
Exactly. Angola's got the very same problem. You know, it's where the CIA goes. If it happens in one place, it's going to happen in another.
The CIA more or less intimates that, well, they're out of the covert action business anymore. But I read recently where they're down in Chiapas helping the government fight the rebels there.
There's not a doubt in my mind that they're in Chiapas. They've been there since day one, I'm sure. And Mexico is just too important to the United States to leave it to the Mexicans. You know what I mean? And I was in Mexico with the CIA in the 60s. And they had a vast operation going there, and especially in their penetrations and work with the Mexican security services. And in fact, it started with the president in Mexico, our operations. A very close relationship with 3 successive presidents, Lopez Mateos, Diaz Ordaz. When it comes to Mexico and this Zapatista movement, what they have to worry about, I think, is not just the armed movement in Chiapas of this armed force of the EZLN, but as an inspiration, they triggered the development of a huge support network, popular movement all over the country, which has come together to support their demands. And the demands are really not outrageous at all.
No, they're not.
They're not outrageous. And the Zapatistas themselves, I could not believe this, that they say, we do not want power. I mean, that's the first guerrilla organization, I think, that has ever said that. The idea always was to take power and then impose or establish or reorganize, do whatever you want to do. But they say, no, we just want to have democracy in this country. And we want to get the PRI out. And the PRI is, of course, so unpopular now. It's carrying on through its patronage system, you know, that's been in power for a long time. So in Mexico, I think they have a much bigger problem than just the armed movement in Chiapas. But it is spread all over the country, and nobody can tell where this is going to lead. The Zapatistas, you know, had this referendum back in August and September, and they had it not only in Mexico. This was a referendum on a number of questions, on the direction in which the people would like to see the country move and how they would like to see the Zapatistas themselves develop, whether they should convert themselves into an independent political movement. And they had international people. I voted in the thing, too, because I'm sitting over there in Germany reading every day through my computer the latest happenings in Chiapas and all over Mexico. And so I'm naturally very interested. I voted on all these questions. There were a whole series of questions. And people, I think they had 80 or 100,000 people outside Mexico who took part in this referendum. And there were several million in Mexico who
What did they do, send out questionnaires to people all around the country?
Well, in my case, all the questions came on through the computer, through the net. And I sent my vote back through the net. And in Mexico, they organized tables all over the country. Oh. And people went and voted on their preferences according to this list of questions. So you can be very sure that the CIA is in there in a very big way. I imagine they're in there with special forces of the United States Army, right in Chiapas. They're doing communications monitoring, I'm sure, of all the transmissions of the Zapatistas, and monitoring the people who come and go. You know, the Mexican Army has tried to put a ring around the area controlled by the EZLN, and it's a very fascinating scene to watch. But when you talk about, going back to your comment about covert action in the 1990s, there are some very interesting things that have come out. For example, even though the Cold War is over, that does not mean that the United States is going to settle for democracy in any particular country. They never have. And the litany is quite long, you know, starting from the 50s, of democratic processes. What is accepted here as legitimate electoral process and pluralistic political parties and so forth. When that goes against U.S. interests, they don't care. I mean, it's not a matter of principle for them. The principle is what's good for us.
You know, what's that famous remark that Kissinger made about the situation in Chile? That,
we shouldn't stand by because of the irresponsibility of the Chilean people. And at the same time, then Nixon was telling the CIA to make the Chilean economy scream.
Yeah.
But what has happened now in the 1990s is that in 1990, Bulgaria. The Bulgarian Communist Party, the former communists, they renamed themselves as the Bulgarian Socialist Party. And they won the 1990 elections in the sense that they took 211 of the 400 seats in the parliament. Do you think that the United States accepted that? All these international observers were there from Western Europe and other places, and they all said this was absolutely free and fair. There was no fraud at all that we could detect. But the United States didn't accept that. And so nowadays, instead of having just the CIA going around behind the scenes and trying to manipulate the process secretly by inserting money here and instructions there and so forth, they have now a sidekick, which is this National Endowment for Democracy, NED.
Yeah.
And this organization dates from 1967. A lot of people don't realize, because it was just established in, I think, 83 or so, but the idea emerged from a series of scandalous revelations in 1967, the worst ones to that point, to hit the CIA. And I was in headquarters at the time that these scandals broke, and the gloom there was something you could touch almost. Because what happened was the long-running CIA's control and manipulation of the international program of the National Students Association in this country, which was the national organization of university students, came out. It was revealed. And that led to revelations of a lot of other CIA operations, because they were using the same bogus and real foundations to channel money into all these different overseas organizations. And I remember very well that Time magazine at the time, or Newsweek, I think it was Time, they published a wheel with all these spokes going out, and the CIA was at the center, and then halfway out were all these foundations, American organizations, and then out at the end were the foreign groups that got the money and the instructions. Naturally, they don't give away money without being sure that it's spent the way they want it spent. And so this was a catastrophe for the CIA, and the next month or the month after that, this started in February of '67, and then by April, I think it was, Dante Fachel, the congressman from Florida, was proposing the establishment of an open system to finance these overseas organizations. And we're talking about some government organizations abroad, some political parties, some media organizations, youth organizations and student organizations, all these kinds of so-called pluralist organizations, when in fact they weren't really free organizations, because to the degree that they take money and instructions from the CIA, to that degree they're not free at all, right? But anyway, Fachel came up with this idea, but it didn't go anywhere, because the so-called consensus between the two parties had broken down over Vietnam. And so it wasn't until the early '80s, when Reagan made his speech in the House of Commons about the democracy project worldwide, that this began to take on steam again. And finally, they decided to copy the German example. Each of the major German political parties has a foundation which is financed by the German government. Before it was West Germany, now the whole country. And, for example, the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung is the SPD, or the Social Democratic Party's foundation. And they finance projects all over the place, and for years in the '50s and '60s, and I would guess even into the '70s. In fact, I know into the '70s and even to the early '80s, the CIA was channeling money through these German foundations abroad. For example, some money, a lot of money, I think it was $1 million or more, but I'm a little hazy on the amount. But anyway, it went through it was CIA money which went through the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. That's the Christian Democratic Union. It went from there to IVEPO, which is a foundation of the COPE, the Christian Democrats in Venezuela. Oh. And from there, it went to the Christian Democrats in El Salvador, to Duarte, for use in the elections. I've forgotten which year, maybe '84 or something like that. And it was traced. Some journalists did this. And so that is the way they would use these German foundations in the past. So now we've got our own. We don't have to use the Germans unless we really want to anymore. Because in 1984, we established this National Endowment for Democracy, which is nothing but a mega conduit. And the millions or the tens of millions that are set aside for the meddling in the internal affairs of other countries goes to this conduit. It's like a bank account or something, but they have a board of directors and they do reports and stuff like that. But then it goes from there to one of four private foundations. One of the Democratic Party, one the Republican Party, or two, three the AFL-CIO, and four the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. These groups then pass it out to recipients in foreign countries. And in the Nicaraguan elections of 1990, I believe the figure was something like 12.5 million that went from the National Endowment for Democracy through these conduits to the UNO political movement there. It was the party, the coalition, you know, of UNO, which is the most ungodly coalition you can ever imagine.
Everything from communists all the way to Somocistas.
That's right. And then they had a trade union front, which also received money. And then they had the Civic Association. Civic Association, I think they call it Via Civica there. That's an old technique of the CIA, is to establish a type of civic organization which will be involved in monitoring elections and things like that. And the first one that I know of was NAMFREL in the Philippines. They established that one around 1950-51 as part of the counterinsurgency against the Huks, the guerrilla movement of the time, because we wanted to have a vehicle for electing our man president of the Philippines. And we did it through this organization, NAMFREL. NAMFREL stands for National Association for Free Elections, I think.
Free.
And, yeah, free elections, when we were financing the whole thing. And NAMFREL was very successful. And our man, Ramon Magsaysay, was elected president. I think it was 52, 53. And unfortunately, he was killed in a plane crash, 57. And so then we switched to Marcos and various other people like that. But NAMFREL never faded away. And in 1986, remember the elections of 1986, which Marcos tried to steal? Well, NAMFREL was alive and well, and they were the ones who denounced the fraud by Marcos. And they then inspired the movement of People Power, which forced him to resign and brought Cory Aquino in as president. So NAMFRA was alive and well. They tried to copy it in Panama. They sent the president of the Chamber of Commerce in the early 80s, or 84 or there, more or less, in preparation for the 87 elections, I think it was. They sent him out to Panama to study the way NAMFRA worked, so he could come back to Panama and establish another one there. And so he did. In Panama, it was called Cruzada Cívica, or Civic Crusade. And this was what was used against the Noriega forces in the streets. It became what they call Rabi Blanca there. You know, the upper-class white people in Panama. It was one of those organizations. But they did take to the streets, and you can remember the pictures on the covers of the magazines, you know, when they had the riots, and Noriega was not overthrown then. But they tried everything in Panama. The CIA was running candidates of its own all through the 1980s, trying to get Noriega out. Maybe not all through the 80s. No, his utility ended about 86, 87.
Because he was working with the CIA.
Yes,
and
yes, it was important for the Contra operation in Nicaragua. But by 87, everybody knew that the Contras were not going to do anything. They weren't going anywhere militarily. And Noriega's importance was in allowing Panama to be used for training them and also for resupply. But that was over by 87, and that's when the efforts began to get him aside, leading to the invasion in 89. But they were up to here in Panamanian politics, and I'm sure they are, using these different types of organizations. So the covert action operations go on. And as a matter of fact, not only in Bulgaria did they overturn this government. I didn't even finish that story, but what happened is all this money from National Endowment for Democracy went in, and they fomented student strikes and demonstrations, trade union strikes, massive street protests, and not only was the money put in by the National Endowment for Democracy, but also Paul Weyrich's Free Congress Foundation got involved. And this is part of the Christian right, you know. He's the man who runs all these different organizations out of the same address in Washington, D.C. And this Free Congress Foundation also got going in there, I guess in coordination with what the CIA was doing, what NED was doing, and so forth. And so the elections were in June. The communists had, or the former communists had won. By the end of November, they were out because they made the country ungovernable. In 1991, they did the same thing in Albania. They had elections there. Free, fair, no fraud. Former communists won. The United States got in there through these different organizations and the CIA, naturally, and they made Albania ungovernable.
Chile, same thing.
Chile, same thing. Brazil in the early 60s, same thing. We were doing the same thing when I was in Ecuador. In fact, we had two coups, two unconstitutional changes of government when I was there, and they were largely due to what we were doing. And by the time I left, after 3 years, we had what we wanted, a four-man military dictatorship that was carrying on a very strong repression against the left.
What's the situation in Haiti now? That's a little bit different situation than, say, Nicaragua was.
Well, Haiti is another example of 1990s operations. Aristide, you know, elected with 2/3 of the vote in 1990, takes office in early 1991. He's thrown out in September. And there's strong, strong evidence that the CIA was pushing this. Because Aristide is not the sort of man they are comfortable dealing with, you know.
No, he wants to elevate the level of the common people, ordinary people, just like in Nicaragua.
Exactly. He comes from liberation theology, and that's always made the United States quite nervous.
Yes.
Because in 1968 at the Medellin Bishops' Conference, you know, they made this what they called a preferential option for the poor. And that was a historical turning point for the Catholic Church in Latin America. I mean, they'd already been doing very good things, certain people, you know, some of the Jesuits, some of the others, and also doing awful things, like in the past, associating themselves with the oligarchies and so forth. But 68, and this decision by the Bishops' Conference was really a major, major event. And the liberation theology moved forward very fast after that through the Christian-based communities, you know, that they established all over Latin America. And these people were dedicated to achieving social justice, one way or another. And Aristide comes from that tradition. So anything like that makes people nervous because it means instability. And I remember so well, all those years I was down there working with the CIA in Latin America, if there was one thing we wanted and was our goal was stability. And just as important, I guess you could say the second one is control. And that's not possible when you get a movement which is clamoring for reform. And Aristide was trying to help the poor of Haiti and reorganize the society. That was his program, along the lines of social justice and so forth. And so when that happens, it makes the United States very nervous, and they couldn't have him. And so they had to ask the generals to take over. And not only did they ask them to take over, but there's any number of reports, and I believe it, that the CIA was paying these generals running the military dictatorship over that 3-year period that killed 4,000 or 5,000 people. And I don't know if you've been following Alan Nairn's reporting in The Nation on Haiti, but he's doing wonderful, just wonderful work. He broke the story that Emmanuel Toto Constant, who had been teaching on liberation theology in the National Intelligence Service, known as SIN, which the CIA established in 86 or 87 as a national service to be used against the narcotics trade coming through Haiti and the Caribbean and that area, which in fact turned into a narcotics dealing organization, as they always do, or often do. But anyway, they'd set up SIN, and Toto was teaching on liberation theology in sin. How bad it was, naturally. It was sinful. And so he then is asked by the CIA and the DIA, who are working together there.
That's the Defense Intelligence.
Yes, that's right. After the coup, to form let's say, a militant action force to balance the forces of Lavalas. That's the Aristide political movement. And so they form the Front for Progress of Haiti, or something like that. It's known as FRAP. You know, F-R-A-P-H, yeah, FRAP, yeah. And so anyway, he organizes this thing, and the CIA pays him to do it. And he's on payroll, they're paying the expenses, and meanwhile these people are killing thousands of Haitians, all on Aristide's side, naturally. And it was just as dirty as you can imagine. And there we were behind this. And this is covert action of the 1990s. I mean, it's not like rigging an election or something. It's worse than that in terms of human cost. And all this has come out thanks to the digging of Alan Nairn and the publication of his findings in The Nation magazine. So Haiti is one of those countries which the United States, you know, it's like the rotten apple theory, you know. Noam Chomsky talks about this all the time, you know. If you get one rotten apple in the barrel, you know it's going to spread to all the others. And so that's why they can't even allow a Haiti, as miserable as the country is,
terrible,
to reorganize for social justice. It's just, well, another eternal shame on the United States, I guess. But now that Aristide is back in, they're probably doing everything they can to defeat his forces, and it's not working, because in the elections that just were held, his party or his organization won the parliament going away. They are in control of parliament now, and there will be a presidential election coming up, perhaps. Nobody seems to know, because there's a possibility that he might take his extra 3 years, you know, and stay on. No, the decision hasn't been made yet. But I think the CIA is going to stay in there in Haiti. They're going to stay in Mexico. They're going to do what they always did. Communism never really was the problem, you know.
No.
It was never the problem in Cuba. It did become a problem when the United States, the Eisenhower administration, decided to overthrow the revolution and turn the clock back to the Batista days. It did become a problem because then the Soviets got in there. They got a base, and they got troops and missile crisis and all that. But that was in reaction. That was all in reaction to the United States' aggression towards Cuba.
And are installing missiles all over the world aimed at the Soviet Union.
So I think that in the 1990s and beyond, we are going to see a lot more of this stuff that we've known in the past. And one of the main reasons is that the United States is imposing this so-called neoliberal economic project. And that is also goes under different names like free market and so forth. But it results without fail, and it's imposed by the IMF, you know, and by the United States bilaterally, and World Bank and all of these organizations, WTO, World Trade Organization now. And It is imposed, and it means in every single case the marginalization of a great mass of the society in a foreign country. These are, could be 10, 20, 40% of the population who are redundant. They're not needed, they're superfluous, because the industry that develops and all the economic development leaves these people aside, just like that is happening now in the United States, and is one of the reasons why the extreme right movement in the United States is growing so fast. But that means that there's going to be resistance. And there will be people out there organizing, like the Zapatistas, for example, and others in Mexico, organizing to resist. And that means that there's a role for the CIA, just like there was when guerrillas were operating in Bolivia or wherever. There's a role for the CIA to collect intelligence on them, to penetrate them, divide, weaken, and destroy these forces. And so we're going to see this, I think, just like in the past. The communist menace was a bogey anyway in Latin America and lots of other places. And just look at what has happened with the communist countries. Take China, big trading partner now. Vietnam, they're getting in there to try to tap that 78 million person market. And they'll be doing it eventually with Cuba. But Cuba is special. They don't want to lose the idea of control in Cuba. And you have these Cuban exiles here, the Jorge Masas of the day, who want to go in there and run the country. Take the Burger King and the McDonald's franchises.
And everywhere they go, you just tick off a list of these countries that have been subjected to CIA covert actions, and you can just see the trail of blood and just horrible things that have happened to the people and the economy. You look at Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, Haiti, Vietnam, Afghanistan.
Oh, Afghanistan.
Afghanistan is absolute chaos and mess.
The what you'd call in Spanish secuela, the aftermath of the Afghan intervention is still going on today. You read about it in the paper every single day, and the numbers of people there have been killed are astronomical. The numbers of refugees is way up there in the millions, and all because of a movement which took control in the country back in the 80s. And which was going to modernize Afghanistan. They were going to change the status of women, who until that time were men's chattels. They were going to educate women to read and write. And Afghanistan at that time was living in the past, with just a few core sectors, you know, which had the education in the West and so forth. And the agency got in there with the Chinese and the Pakistanis, trying to support the opposition to this social development program before the communists took over in Afghanistan and before the Soviets intervened. But what is interesting to me is, in the aftermath, how many of these Arab volunteers, Afghanistan is not an Arab country, but they had a lot of volunteers, Islamic fundamentalists from the Arab countries, who went as volunteers to fight in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, they were volunteers from Algeria, from Morocco, from all of North Africa, Egypt too, Sudan, and other Arab countries, and they went there as volunteers, and they fought. First, they were trained in how to handle the weapons and so forth in these camps provided by the CIA, and then they saw action on the front lines. Well, when it was over, they're called Afghanis in their home countries because they'd gone off as volunteers, even though they're from Arab countries. So these Afghanis, so-called Afghanis, they went back and then they started to foment fundamentalist revolution in their own country. So you see what's happening in Egypt or in Algeria right now. This Algerian civil war has taken 35,000 lives, they say. But this is being run, and some of the main forces there have served in Afghanistan with the meal ticket from the CIA and the training and so forth. Same thing in Egypt with the so-called Islamic group there. And of these people who were tried in New York on the two cases, you know, one the World Trade Center bombing and the other the conspiracy trial for the tunnels in the, you know. I think half of those were trained in Afghanistan. So you see it coming home to roost. This is a typical boomerang effect. The other one is from Afghanistan is the great missile buyback. You know about that one?
No.
Well, In the early 80s, the CIA gave about 1,000 Stinger missiles to the Mujahideen. Those were the anti-communist forces backed by the United States and Pakistan and so forth. They used about, I think they used about 250 of them. So there were 750 left over.
And those are pretty sophisticated.
Well, they are shoulder-fired,
yeah.
heat-seeking, and they were the missiles that turned the balance against the Soviets, or that is, made the cost so high in terms of lost helicopters and jets and so forth, that they had second thoughts about continuing in Afghanistan. It was very effective. But they only used about 250 of them. I think that's the figure that sticks in my mind. I've got it on paper somewhere. But that meant there were 750 left to get back. And naturally, the agency said, we'll take things back, thank you. And the Afghans said, we're keeping them, forget it. And so they disappeared. And Bush, when he was president, I think it was 91, maybe both years, he had to take tens of millions of dollars from his special contingency fund and give it to the CIA for buying them back in the arms bazaars all over the place out there, where they were selling them. They know that the Iranians got some. And the thought, of course, is the danger and the threat is that they're going to shoot down an American airliner or two with these missiles. And so then Carter, not Carter, but Clinton. I'm getting my presidents mixed up. Clinton.
They're all the same. Spineless bastards.
Clinton, then in the summer of his first year in office, which would have been '93, he also had to put up $40 million or something like that to give the CIA, especially to buy back these missiles. And I haven't read yet how many they've been able to buy back, but they've got their people running around from one market to another, trying to get in as many as possible. And that's the sort of thing you run into when you get involved with these kinds of people. I don't think they'll ever probably get them all back, because some are in the hands of the Iranians. But, if they were so naive as to think they could go to these Mujahideen in Afghanistan, hi fellas, we'll take the missiles back, would you please?
As a final question, people say, well, we need the CIA. Other people say we don't need the CIA. Some people say, well, the CIA should be disbanded because its hands are so bloody, but we do need to replace it with something else. What's your opinion on the need for an intelligence agency?
Well, first let me say that there are committees on different levels looking into the current and future role of the whole United States intelligence community, because there's something like 12 organizations, of which the CIA is only one. And they spend $28 billion, I think, is the accepted figure for the overall community budget, of which the CIA gets about $3 billion. And so that's a lot of money involved, and there is a joint White House-Senate committee, which Les Aspin was heading until he died. They are to report in the coming months. I think the House of Representatives has another committee going on it. Groups outside government, like the 20th Century Fund, are also making their own studies, think tanks, in other words. And so it's a period of transition, and they are trying to come up with what the structure and the missions of the intelligence organizations should be. And I think it's realistic to say that, yes, we do need an intelligence service of some sort. There are legitimate targets out there which have to be taken into account. I'm thinking of international terrorism, I'm thinking of the international narcotics trade, I'm thinking of the problem of the proliferation of nuclear weapons and chemical and biological weapons of mass destruction, in other words, and others. So I think that there is certainly a need for an intelligence service and organization, no matter what you call it. It doesn't have to be called the CIA. And the Moynihan plan of dividing the CIA between the Pentagon and the State Department, that still could be a solution, but we'll still have to have some clandestine collection. And the point all these years has been to use intelligence collection to prevent war, especially by accident or miscalculation. And that was very important with the Soviet standoff, you know. Well, I think that the most important things that should be changed, and I don't have any hope right now of changing these things, but the most egregious activities are the subversion and overthrow of democratically elected civilian governments and their replacement with military dictatorships of the highly repressive type that institutionalize torture and disappear people and so forth. That is one thing that we should really try to eliminate, because it's a disgrace on the United States. The CIA's support to murderous security services around the world is another area that really should be looked into. And these most recent revelations on Guatemala and the CIA connections with the murderers of the American Michael Devine and the husband of Jennifer Harbury, the American lawyer, that is indication that these types of support to these security services continuing. And it was happening from the 50s on. I was involved in those activities myself in the 60s. Those have got to be stopped. And then I would say the third area that really should be looked into is the general area of covert intervention in the affairs of other countries. And not just to overthrow, but to try to control and manipulate their institutions of power, whether it be the press or whether it be women's organizations or whatever. And so this is my wish list. Yeah. But I don't have the slightest hope that it's going to happen, because I think that all of these CIA activities are a product of the domestic system in the United States. And until we change the domestic system in the United States, reordering the power structure here, then these things are going to go on, because they are needed by a very few in this country, few and powerful interests. And they relate very closely to the operations of multinationals abroad, U.S.-based multinationals abroad. But it is a period of transition right now in the world at large. It is the largest and the most important period of transition since the late 1940s into the early 50s. It's only a window of opportunity. Decisions are going to be made now about the use of the intelligence services and a lot of other international priorities and domestic priorities in the United States. And I think that everybody who is concerned should be involved in this, but not alone, in concert with others, because an individual, as in the trade union movement, you know, an individual worker has no power at all. He can be fired and replaced at will. But if workers unite and a trade union with strength, then they have power. And the same thing goes in the political scene or a cultural scene or whatever else other sector you may speak of. And so that is why it's so important for people to be involved in groups, the group of choice. And there are many activities out there to be engaged in, such as Solidarity with Cuba to try to break down that blockade of 35 years, or with Guatemala. So there is something out there for everyone, and we only have ourselves to blame if we don't take action now.
Phil was in the CIA for 12 years and then quit after he saw what the CIA was actually doing, all the terrible things doing in the areas where he was working, particularly in Ecuador, Mexico, and Uruguay. He resigned in 1969 to write his first big book, Inside the Company, or CIA Diary. Since then, he's written 5 books, the last one being On the Run, which tells about his experiences after he got out of the CIA, when he was in Europe and trying to write his book, and the CIA was hounding him from country to country, doing everything it could to keep him from writing this book. Would you mind, I'm sure you told this story hundreds of thousands of times before, you could tell us your famous typewriter story about...
Sure, I'm glad to. I hope we have enough tape for it, because it's a long story, but I'll try to make it short, just the bare bones.
Well, that's okay. That's okay. We have lots of tape.
Oh, all right. Well, what happens is this. Just to set the scene, I had left the CIA at the end of 1968. Had turned against the work, but I hadn't any intention of writing a book, or doing anything. I wanted to start a new life, and among the things I did was to re-enroll in university. I stayed living in Mexico City, where I'd worked on the Olympics, and I went into a doctoral program in Latin American Studies at the National Autonomous University there in Mexico City, the huge one. And as I plowed through these studies, month after month, doing the reading, doing the writing of the papers and so forth, I was studying, you know, the horrors of the conquest and the genocide of the colonial period, the forced labor and all of that, the wiping out of an entire culture, and then the United States domination in the post-colonial period. I was thinking, and I came to the conclusion that what I and my colleagues were doing was nothing more than a continuation of all this. It started at that time nearly 500 years earlier. And that led me to think that maybe it wouldn't be a bad idea to expose what we were doing. It had been an unthinkable idea until then. Nobody had ever done it. And I was pledged to secrecy, but I began to think that maybe staying silent on all this was worse than doing it, you know. In fact, I could see some very positive things in a book. And so I began looking around Mexico City for resources. I needed to reconstruct events to show our hand at events, and I couldn't find them in Mexico City, so I had to choose. And I chose for the book, came to Europe, and spent a year in France. And I made a mistake early on. I wrote a letter to the leading Latin American, or certainly South American, political weekly called Marcha at that time. And it's published in Montevideo. And I had mentioned how we intervene in elections because they had elections coming up, and I was hoping to aid the Frente Amplio with this letter, which they did publish, and I didn't know they'd published it. So one night in Paris, it knocked on the door in my hotel, and there is an old friend from the CIA. And we go out and have a few drinks, and he says, "Phil, I guess you know that I'm here for a reason." And I said, "Well, yeah, I think you are. What is it?" And then he takes out this thing, he puts it on the paper, and it's a Xerox copy of my article, which was published in this newspaper, or weekly, in Uruguay, Marcha. And he said, "Mr. Helms wants to know about this," because I'd mentioned in it that I was writing a book.
He was the head of the CIA.
He was director then. And he sent this Keith over to see me. And anyway, I said, "Don't worry, I'm not going to reveal any secrets. I'm going to submit it for review and all of that." You know, I just wanted to get him off my back. Well, anyway, my children were visiting. It was over Christmas and New Year's of that year, 71, 72. And so I took them, and in the wee hours of the morning went over to the railway station and got a ticket, and we went to Spain, got out of there. And then eventually they flew back to the States to go back to school from Madrid, and I went back to Spain. To Paris. But a few months later, a young American befriended me, a fellow whose name was Sal Ferreira. And he was a journalist, or he said he was a journalist, an underground journalist who was representing a couple of groups in the States, and he was over in Paris to cover the peace talks then going on between Le Duc Tho of Vietnam and Henry Kissinger. We saw each other from time to time. I was living in a very cheap hotel on the West Bank, just down from the Sorbonne, and on the corner there was a cafe called Le Yam. And he came in there, and that's where he met me. I'd go down there in the evenings for a beer or something. And so I was desperate for money. I was really, I didn't know how I could continue working on my book, because I was running out of money. I had no money, in fact, to speak of, just enough for a little food every day, and I was getting desperate. And I had rented a typewriter from a typewriter shop at Odeon. And eventually I had to turn that typewriter back in to get the deposit back. In the meantime, I had taken a big chance. I had told Sal who I was and what I was doing, hoping he might do an interview he could sell to Playboy for $10,000 and give me $5, you know. And so he was recording all this stuff about the CIA and the book I was working on. It was my only hope to get some money, and he did give me money, as a matter of fact. You know, a little bit here and a little bit there, just to keep me going. And one time he invited me to dinner the next week. Oh, by the way, when I was with him, I'd noticed surveillance in the street. Oh. And I was being followed around from about February of 1972 on. And the first time that happened, that night I went very late at night. I checked out of the hotel and made sure nobody was there, and took a taxi over to the area where a friend of mine lived, a woman whose name was Catherine, in the Passy section of Paris. And I asked her if I could stay in her place for a few days. It turned out to be 6 months or more, because I had to stay in secret. And so I wouldn't tell anybody where I was living. I wouldn't tell Sal or anybody else. Anyway, he invites me to dinner. We go to dinner, and he says, we're walking up the hill there to Rue Mouffetard, and he points out this English-style pub. He says, let's have a beer there afterwards. They've got English beer in there. I said, fine. So we went to dinner, came back, went into the pub, and there's a bar here, and there's a stool here, stool here, stool, and so forth, and these are empty, and he sits on the one on the end, I sit on the one next to him. We order our beer, and in comes this rather attractive, voluptuous, young American woman, or woman, let's say, carrying a Time magazine, so you could tell she was American. And so she starts to talk to me, and she is a Venezuelan heiress. I mean, an American, but had been raised in Venezuela, and her parents had died and left her a lot of money. And she had just spent the academic year over in Geneva at the University of Geneva studying French. And she was going to spend the summer in Paris. So she wanted to know what I was doing, and I said, well, I'm trying to write a book. And she said, oh, the great American novel. And I said, not exactly. I said, it's about American foreign policy in Latin America. And she says, oh, isn't that awful? Awful. And I said, it's partly about the CIA, too. And she said, oh, awful. I can't stand those people. That's terrible. And so anyway, we talk a little bit, and she says, well, look, call me. I'll invite you to dinner. And so she writes out her telephone number and gives it to me. So I'm thinking, well, what is this going to lead to? And I didn't call her. And I left, went through my routine, not to be followed back to the little room where I was staying. And about a week later, I see Sal, and to do some more of this recording for the interview. He was notoriously slow on that, which made me very suspicious. And he brings up this woman. He said, by the way, did Leslie, she used the name Leslie Dunnigan. Did Leslie, did you call Leslie, and did you talk to her and see her? And I said, no, Sal, I'm not interested. Here, you take the telephone number and you call her. He said, no, but remember, she's got money. She's an heiress, and maybe you could talk her into supporting you and financing your book. I said, well, Sal, maybe I should talk to her. So what I did was I called her. She said, oh, hello, how are you? Yes. Well, yeah, let's have dinner. Come on over, and I'll take you to dinner. So she lived down in Montparnasse on Rue Pitard. I went over to her place. It was this big, tall, modern building. I went up to the studio she had rented, and so we'd sit around talking, have a drink or something. Then she takes me out to dinner. It's a very romantic place with red and white checkered tablecloths and candles and everything, and have our steak frite. And then we go back to her place, and we're sitting there talking, maybe having another drink, a little wine or something, I guess. And it was either that time or the next time that I decided to tell her who I was and see if I get some money out of her. So I did. And she said, oh, yes, I'll do that. I'll help you. But, you know, I can't stand Paris. It's too boring. I'll leave you this apartment, this studio apartment for the summer. You can have the key, and here's I've forgotten how many thousands of francs she gave me. And I'm going off to see my boyfriend in Barcelona, and we're going to Mallorca for the summer. So I have the apartment, I have the money, and all I needed was some help, because I had to get a clean draft of what I had done so far, ready for Barney Rossett of Grove Press, who was coming through Paris on the way from the Frankfurt Book Fair back to the States in October. So there was another person who I'd met in this Cafe Yams, French-Canadian, whose name was Therese. And she was doing secretarial work. She had raised her children in the United States. She had married an American. They were divorced. She had a son and a daughter she used to talk about all the time. And we had a lot of political conversations. She was very, very hip politically. So I asked her if she would... as a matter of fact, I asked somebody else first, but that's another story. The woman freaked out and had a nervous breakdown when I told her who I was and what I was doing. Her eyeballs started rolling around in her head, and oh, God. She had to go to the American hospital in Paris. Then I said, well, okay, I'll ask Therese. So I asked Therese. She said, sure, I'll help you. I'll come over there in the evenings. We'll do it in the evenings after I get off work, because she was working in a law firm over there at that time. So I gave her the address and keys and everything, and I would go over and wait for her. And she'd get there about 7:30 or 8. And this was Leslie's apartment. And you can guess the end of the story, naturally. Leslie was working with the CIA the whole time, and they were recording everything Therese and I were saying in this apartment. But anyway, we used the apartment. She got the whole thing done. And Leslie then comes back from Mallorca in September, and she and Sal kind of team up together. And they're giving me money still. She's giving me money. And then I finish what I'm doing in Paris. I'm going to go over to London to finish, because the British Museum Newspaper Library, this fantastic institution, has newspapers from all times and all places. And they had all the local papers from the places where I'd worked in the CIA, from the times I was working there. And so I could go over there and read all the newspapers that I was reading, you know, when I was there. And that's what made my book, by the way, because everything we did of importance came out in the newspapers, save our hand in these events. But that's jumping ahead a little bit. What happens is this. I had this borrowed typewriter from Sal, which I was using, and one night Leslie comes in the rain to a place where we were going to meet. It was a cafe in on the West Bank, and she comes in with this typewriter. It's a used typewriter, and she said, Phil, the guy who owns that typewriter that Sal gave you is back, and he needs it back immediately. But here's one that I bought for you from a used typewriter store. And so I said, oh, fine. And I I had to go back and get that other typewriter from Katrine's room, you know, and bring it back over because the guy had to have it. So I didn't want to carry this one. I didn't need a typewriter. I was making recordings then for London. And these were operational episodes, maybe 40 or 50 secret operations which I was trying to describe on tape to use over in London. And so I didn't need the typewriter. I put it in Therese's apartment. She always left the door open. She wasn't there. I just stuck it in there to have it out of the way. And then I went back to get the other typewriter, brought it back, gave it to Leslie. And then a few days later, we're at lunch, and Leslie is giving me the money that I need to get over to London and last for a couple of weeks before they come over, supposedly, to help me continue working on the book and doing the research. And Sal says, over lunch, says, by the way, Phil, how's the typewriter that Leslie gave you working? And I said, well, Sal, I haven't used it yet. I didn't need it. I'm doing recordings right now, and I left it in Therese's place. Well, I got the money, but later on I was talking to Sal. He says, Phil, you know, Leslie's so upset about the typewriter. She had that terrible cold, and she went out in the rain and got that typewriter for you. And, you know, we all know Therese never locks her apartment. She's already had a radio and other stuff stolen from there. And if the typewriter is stolen, Leslie's going to be so upset. And she's already so hurt. She might not continue financing. So I took the typewriter, and I took it over to Katrine's place. And it was there for a few days before I was ready to go to London. And on a Saturday afternoon, I'd finished the tapes, went out to get a beer, came back up the steps, and this building was where the servants lived, to a very elegant building in the 16th arrondissement, which is the richest area of Paris. And so it was a small maid's room where Katrine and I was staying with her. And so I came up the steps, went down this dark hallway, and there in front of her door, I saw these two people, a man and a woman, standing at the door as if they'd just knocked. But as I approached down this dark hallway, they backed off from the door over to the other side of the hallway and began to embrace and to kiss, it looked like. And they had coats on. It was already, I think, the end of October, early November. And so I stopped at her door and knocked, and she opened the door. And she started to laugh at the people over there. I said, wait a minute, I think they're monitors or something. I think the CIA's caught me. I think they've caught me. I went in, closed the door, and the reason I thought that was that Katrine used to like to listen to the radio. It was a Philips table model recorder thing with radio and FM and all that. And for the last days, when she was listening to it, there was this beeping sound on the radio. And I thought it was propagation from ORTF, which is the radio television center in Paris, and we were so close there. But it was a kind of an irritating thing. It was like beep, 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 like that. And as I was standing there, and these people were embracing, and I was waiting for her to open the door, I was hearing the beeping sound. I thought, my God, that sound. We hadn't even spoken about it. But I was thinking, it's so loud now, it's coming all the way out in the hallway. When she opened the door, I noticed the radio was off. Oh. And so I said, listen, I was hearing a beeping sound that I was hearing on the radio, but I was hearing it out in the hallway. The radio was off. She said, yeah, the guy's got a hearing aid in his ear. And they've got those bulky things under their coats. And so I went in there and I said, I'm going to try to find out what's in there because they found me now. And she said, well, I'll follow them. And so they went down the steps, and she was after them. But they forgot that it's on the middle level, like on the third floor level or so, because this building is built on the bank going down to the Seine, and it doesn't have a street in front of it. It has this passage. It's a walkway that goes down. And so they went all the way to the bottom where the garbage cans are kept for everybody in the building. And there's a door there, but you have to have a key to get in or out of that door. And they were trying the door and trying. They couldn't. She told me that when she came back up. She went over and fiddled around with some garbage cans and just watched them, and they whispered some things, and they went back up and out and disappeared. She came back, told me the story. And then I started fooling around with this typewriter, and I thought, damn, I fell for it. And I turned on the radio, and you could get this signal at several frequencies, but there was one that was really loud or strong. And so I began to turn I thought that they had DF'd some kind of transmitter, you know. That's how they... Direction finding. That's right. Yeah. And that's how they could find the box, which is where they found me. And so I began to turn the typewriter around slowly like this, and depending upon the axis of the box that held the typewriter, the signal was louder or softer. So I knew there was a directional transmitter in there, and I had to find it. I thought first it might be in the roller or wherever, but then I started checking the inside of the roof of the box, and I pulled off the upholstery. And there, before my eyes, was this most amazing thing. It was a transmitter, homemade transmitter. All these transistors and batteries and antennas and things, all in notches carved out of a very thin piece of plywood that wasn't even a maybe quarter-inch plywood or something. And it was an amazing sight to see, and I, of course, realized. And then I had to get rid of a lot of papers the next day, and I went out on the Seine, and there was a little beach there where I took a whole suitcase full of papers to make a bonfire. Because it was too much to tear up and all that. So I made this bonfire out there, and it's blazing and everything, and it was just down the river from the Eiffel Tower, and you could see it right over there. And one time I looked up, and there was this guy with a camera, with a handheld camera, a motion picture camera, and he was supposedly filming the Eiffel Tower, but I think he was filming me doing this bonfire with all these papers. And so I kind of freaked at that. But anyway, the result was that I left her place, and I went over to Montmartre on the other side of Paris, and I changed hotels for the rest of the days I was there, maybe 3 or 4 days, because it takes one day for those slips to catch up with the police. The registry slips that you have to fill out in the hotels in Paris. And so I was changing hotels, staying one day ahead of the CIA and the French police, and then I took the boat over to, took the train up to Calais and across to Folkestone. And on the boat they were waiting for me, the British immigration. And when I got up there, they said, "Oh yes, take a seat over there, Mr. A.G., and we'll call you." And so time went by, and I had all these tapes on me, and I had all the work that I'd done in Paris in a year, and before that in Mexico, and I thought, what is going to happen? And the tapes were very incriminating, and I thought they might just take them away from me. And so it was raining like hell on the crossing. It was quite rough and everything, but I went up in that rain on the top deck. I threw the tapes, all my tapes over, because I didn't want them caught or anybody to see them. So that was gone. And then they called me back to the desk and said, "Where are you staying?" Well, I had this old copy of Europe on $5 a day that everybody used at that time. Now it's Europe on $100 a day, I suppose. But it was the cheapest places to live. And so I had chosen some bed and breakfast by Argyle Square, near the stations, St. Pancras and King's Cross. And I gave them a wrong address. Also taken, but it was a little bit more expensive than this cheapest place. So I lied to them and went on from the train to this place and checked in this bed and breakfast, and this was the most depressing area. Oh God, it was awful. Over Christmas of 1972, because it was foggy and cold and rainy, and they had these yellow street lights in London in this section. It was all old red brick buildings and ugly, and it was a far cry from café au lait and croissant in Paris every morning. But anyway, I continued on the book. I got the money from Penguin Books, and that solved the problem. Then I just went on and did the book. And in the meantime, the day I left Paris to come to London, Therese was arrested. And I learned this on the telephone because I'd made telephone arrangements to speak with Sal and Leslie after I got to London, because they were coming over. I talked to Sal, and he says, "Oh, everything terrible has happened. You can't imagine. They picked up Therese and they took her into the prefecture, and they talked to her all day about you, interrogating her, wanting to know this and wanting to know that." And Leslie got so scared with this that she went down to Madrid. I said, "Why to Madrid? She's got to come over here. She's got the money." He said, "Well, I'm going down there too. You're too hot right now. We've got to all go down to Spain." And so then he goes down to join her there, and we're on the phone all the time. They're calling me now because the British pay telephones could be called from outside. You know, they would ring it, so we'd make a plan, and I'd go there and stand by the phone until it rang. And so they went down to Malaga, and they did everything they could do to get me to go to Spain. And I, of course, was on to, I mean, I knew, even though I'd had doubts before, now I had proof. And so I wouldn't go. But I said, "Send me the money, and I'll go in an indirect way, so I don't have to go through airport passport controls and things like that. I'll take train, I'll take buses, things like that." And they wouldn't do it. I said, "No, I'll come. I was naturally going to just keep the money. I wasn't going to go by any means to Spain. At that time, it was Franco, it was fascism. I knew the CIA was thick as thieves with the fascist security services. I knew that from my own experience. And so I wasn't going to go. But in the meantime, I got relief from Penguin Books, and that changed my whole life. I was able to go on to the book. Leslie disappeared, and Sal went back to Paris, and they didn't come over. And then I wrote the book, it came out, and after the book had come out, maybe a year or so afterwards, I was in Geneva, and I happened to meet someone who said, oh, Mr. A.J., I'm Ecuadorian, you know, and I've read your book, and it is fabulous. Everybody in Ecuador is up in arms about it. And we knew all the names that were in there. And by the way, I think I know that Leslie Donegan that was working against you in Paris. This is years afterwards, you know. This is like from 72 to 76 or 77. 76 probably. And I said, what do you mean? He says, well, I think she's working at the United Nations right now, but she uses a different name. Here she calls herself Janet Strickland. I said, well, how do you know she's the same person? Well, my best friend is a Spanish guy who works for the UN here too. And his best friend is a Spanish guy, and she told her boyfriend, who's a Spanish guy, that she was working for the CIA against you, and he told my friend, and my friend told me. And I said, well, I wonder if we can see her. He said, oh yeah, I know where her office is. He was working for one UN agency, she was working for the ILO, the International Labor Organization. And so we drove over to the ILO building, parked in the basement. I sat in the cafe while he went up to see if she was in her office, and she was in the office. He came back down. So I went up the elevator, 9th floor or so, walked down the hallway around the corner, and I looked different then, because when I was in Paris and she was working on this thing, I had very long hair, I had a huge Zapata-style mustache, and you know, I was pretty creepy looking. But by this time I cut my hair, and I was normal. And so I just walked down that hallway, looked in very carefully, and walked on, and it was she. And so I went on back down, got with him, and then I was back in Paris, and I wrote up the story. And I took it to René Bachmann, an editor at Nouvel Observateur, which is the sort of Time Newsweek of France, guy I knew. And he said he loved the story, and they wanted to publish it. And here the CIA person was now working on another name in the UN, no less. So he said, what about photographs? I said, what do you mean photographs? I don't have any photographs of her. You can get some photographs of her, maybe. No, you and she together. I said, you mean confrontation? He said, yeah, I've got 2 photographers over there who are great people. They could do something marvelous. We'd have really good photographs. I said, René, if you'll pay my way over there and pay the hotel, I'll do it, or I'll try to do it. So, back to Geneva. I go to see Dani Gignoux, who is the photographer, a woman, and her friend Hans, who's also a photographer. They're working together. And so we make our plan, and the plan included going down after this thing in her office, if we could do it. Then we would not go to the elevator, but we thought there'd be a fuss. So we would go down, we would find the stairway, and we knew where it was, and we would go down 4 or 5 flights real fast, and then go over to the elevator and down and out, and you know, we had the car. So we got it all ready, and the night before in the hotel, I practiced in my bathroom mirror the most ferocious looks I could put on my face, because I wanted to scare her, really scare this, you know what, out of her. And so the next morning, we got in the car. They had all their equipment over to the ILO, parked the car in the basement, up the elevator to her floor, down the hallway and around the corner, and the door is closed where it had been open before. I said, oh my God, she's not working today. I knocked on the door, come in. And so I open the door and walk in and start walking over to her desk, which was on the other side by the windows. Dani goes over here to this corner. Hans closes the door behind him and stands in front of the door. And I walk over to her, and I'm leaning over on her desk like this, and I'm saying, hello, Leslie, using the old name. Yeah. You thought I'd never find you, didn't you? I said, well, I found you, and now I'm going to get you. You could have gotten me killed back then, and now I'm going to get you. And she let out this primal scream you can't imagine. She got up, she went over to the door, and we had this fabulous photo taken by Dani, where she's really big, she was tall, maybe in those heels she was over 6 feet. And so she's grabbing him by the arm to pull him away from the door, and she's screaming all the time. She opens the door and goes running down the hallway screaming at the top of her voice. We hustle out to the stairwell, down to the car and out. Back to the studio, got the photographs. They came out perfect. Oh. They were great. And so back on the plane to Paris, give it all to René, and it's coming out on Thursday, about 4 days later. Thursday, I go to the newsstand, buy the magazine, and where's the story? It's not in there. Oh. And I call René, I said, René, what the hell is this? And he said, oh, Phil, I'm so sorry. Jean Daniel has killed the story. And Jean Daniel was the chief editor. He happened to be the man that Kennedy had sent to see Fidel in November of '63, and he was about improving relations. And he was sitting in Fidel's office when Fidel got the first word of Kennedy's assassination. And John Darnielle had told Rene, well, we're not in the business of exposing CIA operations. And so it was dead. And I didn't do anything until, more on the story, until November, when my deportation crisis started in Britain. And this was brought on by Henry Kissinger, who, Secretary of State then, made this long trip over there, this secret trip over there, and forced the British to take action against me and started a whole series of deportations. But the Sun newspaper in London, all the media descended on me in Cambridge. And the Sun wanted their special angle. You know, they're the third-page nude every day, the mass tabloid newspaper sells 4 million, 5 million copies a day. And so they wanted some kind of sex angle, and I thought, well, I'll give you a story. And so I gave them the Leslie Janet story. And darned if they didn't find Leslie Dunnigan. They got their New York bureau onto it, and they found Leslie Dunnigan, a motel clerk in Georgia. And she swore that she'd never worked for the CIA, never worked against me, had never even been to Europe. And so it was obviously a false lead. The last question was, have you ever heard of a Janet Strickland? Oh, sure. She was my best friend. We grew up in Crocus together.
Oh, so she switched names.
Janet Strickland apparently was the real name, and she took her friend's identity. And so then they found the family. They were in an enormous villa in Palm Beach. And Leslie Janet was there. It was her parents' place. And her father turns out to be the head of all the Exxon operations in Latin America. Oh. And the photographer and the journalist go down there, and the father comes down and threatens to punch the photographer, and he got a picture. And so the Sun then ran a 3-part series on this. The spy who, I've forgotten now what that headline was, but it was front-page stuff, you know. And that's the story. And I don't know where she is now. Sal disappeared.
Gosh. And the circle was complete.
I told you it was a long story.
The circle was complete. The oil man's daughter was working for the CIA.
Incredible, incredible. But in any case, I have right now a lawsuit going in the Federal District Court in Washington under the Federal Tort Claims Act for $6 million because we found in documentation that I received under the FOIA in a long-running lawsuit from late 70s to early 80s that the CIA had committed criminal actions against me during that period in which I was in contact with Sal and Leslie, early 70s. And the documents are highly censored, so we didn't get the exact nature of this. But it happened that the CIA tried to get a criminal indictment against me when my first book first came out. This is early 75, and Colby was the director. And they had to back down because the Justice Department, which was getting the facts to take to the grand jury, discovered all this illegal activity in the files. And they told the CIA, if we indict and prosecute, then AG is going to have access to all this through criminal discovery procedure. They said, no, that can never see the light of day. And 5 times in the 70s, starting in 75, including when George Bush was director, they tried to get an indictment against me, and 5 times they backed down because this was so sensitive. And I think it's going to come out now in my torts claim lawsuit that this was a murder plot. It was a plot to make me disappear, and that the Spanish services were going to do the job if they could get me to go to Spain. That is Sal and Leslie. Not that they knew what was really going to happen. Their job was to get me in Spain, and then the Spanish would take over. And there was nothing to them to, disappear somebody. Yeah. Those period. So I'm hoping that we will get all the facts out, and find out what they really were planning.
That's ironic. You're doing some work now studying for your new book, I think, studying the development and the history of the CIA, OSS, Nazis and neo-Nazis. Is that correct?
Yes, in a way. What I'm doing is 2 things. I am teaching a course at the University of Hamburg entitled The CIA, the Cold War, and Right-Wing Extremism. And the content of those lectures in that course, and sources and so forth, they are going to be a book. So that the lectures will be chapters of a book. And I don't know when I'll have that finished. I hope I have it finished next year. But I'm teaching the course in any case as I go along because it's in development. And what I'm trying to do is write a selected history of the Cold War and and show how there is a continuity between the fascist and Nazi movement of the 20s and 30s and 40s, the Mussolini, Hitler, and various other countries, with what's happening in Western Europe and the United States today. Because one of the most phenomenal things that has occurred and hasn't gotten all that much publicity, except with Oklahoma City it is beginning to, is the growth of the extreme right in Europe and in the United States. That is Western Europe and the United States and Canada, over the last 10 or 15 years. To me, it's really alarming. And it's due in part to the fact that United States policy after the war in Western Europe kept these movements alive. And they used the Nazis and the SS and the war criminals to continue the war against the Soviet Union. That is, the United States just took over the German war against the Soviet Union and used these people to continue it, but not as open warfare with troops and so forth. It was an underground warfare. It was the Cold War. And the CIA was one of the most important, if not the most important, instruments in the Cold War in carrying on this struggle against the Soviet Union and all of Eastern Europe, its allies. And they were carrying on an undeclared war for 10 years through paramilitary operations. And what happened was, as the Red Army was advancing to the west, the people who had collaborated with the Nazis during the occupation of the Baltic areas of Eastern Europe, of Belarus, of Ukraine and parts of Russia, where they found fascists everywhere, and they formed SS battalions. And it was really these local people in the Baltics. It wasn't the Nazi SS or Waffen-SS so much who massacred more than 1 million Jews, but it was the local people who formed, because there were 500,000 non-Germans organized into Waffen-SS units. And these were the ones that hunted down all the communists they could find, all the socialists they could find, all the trade unions they could find, and especially all the Jews that they could find. And those huge massacres like Babi Yar, those were carried out largely by the local people who were fascists before Germany ever invaded. As a matter of fact, the Ukrainians, after the Bolshevik Revolution, they formed an organization of exiles in Paris. So did Russians. This is the 20s. And these people are cultivated by the Nazis and trained, and there was a Ukrainian army on the front lines with the German troops as they, from the OUN as they marched in 1939, or 41 actually, when they crossed the border. But these people retreated back with the retreating Nazi troops, and by war's end you had something like 7 million displaced persons or refugees in these camps all over, mostly in West Germany. And the United States then began to recruit and to organize from these camps. And the key figure there was Hitler's chief of intelligence for the Eastern Front, Reinhard Gehlen. And Gehlen came from a Prussian family, Prussian military tradition. And he had made his life's work of studying the Soviet Union. And in his organization, which had the German initials FHO, that means Foreign Armies East in German, he had accumulated the most marvelous records of any country in the world, I mean far and away, on the Soviet Union. And he had been doing this since the 1920s. And he had risen very fast. He was only 43 years old when the war ended. He had a lifetime ahead of him. Wow. And so what does he do? At the last days of the war, he microfilms all the files. He puts the microfilm in steel drums, and he loads them all on trucks. And with his top people, they drive from their office, their headquarters near Berlin, all the way down to the Alps in Bavaria. And they start trudging up, or getting the trucks up there, and then carrying these drums up into a meadow where they buried them. And they walked back down the mountains, and they waited for the Clark Army to come through. I think it was Clark. And once they were in occupied territory of the Americans, they left their hotel, or wherever they were staying, I think they were in a hotel, and turned themselves in. And Gehlen, he was a general, he presented himself as a general surrendering to the Americans. And he said, I have some interesting things to tell you. And he had his principal aides, of course, with him and everything. And his main chiefs of sections and all that, they had a plan. They laid low. after the war ended to reorganize later. And so they took Galen to Camp King, which had, the German name was Dulag Luft. And this is where the Germans brought all the downed pilots and crews for interrogation. It was just north of Frankfurt, a big military compound, a base. Well, we took over that. The United States Army took over this base and renamed it Camp King. And there they debriefed Galen on what he'd been doing, what he had, and he made a proposition. He said, I want to continue my war against the Soviets. Well, the Soviets were after him because he was a war criminal. He was responsible for interrogating, or for the interrogations of the millions of Soviet prisoners of war in the different camps in Germany. And they died by the millions. But he was in charge of getting the information out of them that they were capable of giving, and torture and, you know, all that was going on. And so the Soviets were looking for him to try him as a war criminal. They asked the Americans, have you arrested Galen? Do you know anything about him? You can guess the answer. Yeah. No, we don't know a thing. We don't know a thing. So in order to protect him, they flew him to Washington. He turned himself in early May of 1945, and by June or July he was in Washington at one of the military installations in Washington. Stayed there a year. And the Counterintelligence Corps, this was before the CIA was established, set him up in business back in Germany. And it became known as the ORG, the Galen operation. ORG meaning organization, the Galen organization. And then he started recruiting all these people, including SS, including war criminals, and so forth. And they took over an SS compound in Pullack, a little town just south of Munich. And that's where they started up. And then they opened offices in different places under commercial cover and so forth, and the CIA took the whole thing over in '47. But Galen was he was the key figure in recruiting these people from Eastern Europe to go to the training camps to be trained in military skills as saboteurs and so forth. And then they were sent back into their home countries to foment rebellion, to retard economic development or recovery after the war, you know, so that there could be this big contrast between Eastern and Western Europe. These things went on for 10 years, and Galen was one of the principal figures. They, of course, were never able to really take control of any of these countries, but the outbreak of violence in Berlin in the early years, early 50s, of Poznan in Poland, 53, I think, 56 in Hungary, that did a lot of damage in the East Germany, for example. They were often caught, though, and it happened that one of the big operations in the late 40s and early 50s was to overthrow the government of Albania and restore King Zog as in power. He was sitting in Egypt waiting to go back to Tirana. And this operation was a strange failure because they had all these teams organized, and they brought them in maritime operations on the sea. They brought them overland from Greece. They dropped them in from black overflights, what were known as black overflights, and one after another got rolled up. Sometimes the forces were there waiting for them, and they would double the WT operators, the WT, the wireless, the radio operators. Oh. And they would then give them disinformation to send back, and of course they were sending under duress, and there were suspicions and so forth, until finally when Philby defected, that's Kim Philby, the Soviet penetration of the British intelligence service, they knew what had gone wrong, because Philby was the British officer on the British side for this Albanian operation. And so he was telling the Soviets everything in advance, and they telling the Albanians, and so there are several different examples. There's one in Poland also, known as WIN, W-I-N, which were the Polish initials for the organization. And this was supposedly the remnants of the Home Army, the so-called Home Army that had been under control of the London Poles during the war, which the British and the Americans wanted put in power there, and the Soviets refused, and that was one of the major factors that opened up the Cold War. But for years they were dropping in gold bars, gold coins, weapons of all sorts, and ammunition and stuff, and till finally one day on Polish National Radio they came on the air and exposed the whole thing. And the way it all started was that they had sent this general to London to say what his forces were back in Poland, and they bought. And then they organized all this stuff through this general who was really working for the Poles from the start. So there are lots of these cases, and these paramilitary operations were finally ended. They were responsible for for fomenting the uprisings in East Germany in the early 1950s, in the Poznan uprising in Poland, and then the Hungarian uprising in 1956. But the radio broadcast to these people had been ambiguous. By that time, you know, 1950 on, they had one radio operation going to all the different languages of the Soviet Union, and that was first Radio Liberation. But then they changed it because they weren't going to liberate anybody. So they changed it to Radio Liberty. And then there was Radio Free Europe, which broadcast in the languages of the other Eastern European countries. Both were based in Munich, and both were hot houses for war criminals from those countries, because not only did these Nazi collaborators from the various countries of Eastern Europe come back and then let themselves be formed into paramilitary gangs to go back, but also they flocked to these radio stations because they had the languages and they had the political background and so forth. So you had all these fascist war criminals in the CIA-funded radio stations. They were not known as CIA-funded at the time. Supposedly they were private donations from the United States and so forth. But anyway, those paramilitary operations ended after the Hungarian revolt of 1956. There was a special investigation under Eisenhower, and they called them off. But the propaganda and the political operations continued. So in this book I'm writing and in the course I'm teaching, I'm trying to show how these efforts to continue the war against the Soviet Union, using the Nazis and fascists and so forth, and the war criminals, how these provided a continuity for the survival of these movements, which is today so manifest in Eastern Europe and Western Europe and in the United States, although it's a different situation over here because there's very large religious content to the extreme right movement here. And in between, to show how fascist or fascist-style governments were installed in so many places around the Third World. And of course it starts in the Philippines and goes to Vietnam and continues through the whole American war in Vietnam, and all over Latin America, and even in Africa, in Korea, for example, with the partition of Korea in 1945. I'm trying to show how there was no real democratic principle behind this policy. It was pragmatic and without principle, really. It was simply to make sure that these governments were on our side against the Soviets, and that they allowed our companies to come in and operate and so forth and so on. But there are so many fascinating areas. Greece, for example, is one of the more fascinating places because there was a very big resistance in Greece to the Nazi occupation from about 1941 on. And the main resistance forces were, there was a coalition, and the principal or the strongest in the coalition were the communists in Greece. And the Nazis formed what they called security battalions made of Greeks, and these were military units. And their job was to eliminate the resistance. And so it was Greek on Greek fighting all through those years. And then at the end of the war, the British invaded Greece because the liberation forces, the Greek resistance forces, they took over the whole country. They set up an entire administration in all of Greece, and the British invaded it to put them down, just like the French invaded in Vietnam to put down the liberation forces there. And then they set up a provisional government. They brought the king back and so forth. And then the Greek Civil War started because of all the repression against the liberation forces. This Civil War goes on from 47 to 49. And after it's over, the CIA establishes a National Greek Intelligence Service, known by the initials KYP. That's the Greek letters for CIA. They give the same name. And this was formed with the officers from the old security battalions, the fascists, hunters of the liberation forces. And these are the same men who in 1967 overthrew the democratic government and established a 7-year reign of military dictatorship with the institutionalization of torture, forced exile of thousands of Greeks and so forth. Italy, another very interesting case where even as the United States and Britain were the occupying powers in Italy after the war, they allowed the Mussolini fascists to establish a new fascist party, and fascism was illegal. It was outlawed after the war, but still, Giorgio Almirante, for example, who had been Mussolini's last minister of propaganda in the so-called Salo Republic, which is a puppet government run by the Germans in the north of Italy in the last months of the war, he established the Italian Social Movement, or MSI, in 1946, right under the noses and with the approval or acceptance by the United States and Britain. They could have stopped it. But that party survived through the years and grew and grew and grew until it came into government last year. And this is a party which dates from the Mussolini party. I mean, it's a direct descendant. And it's run now by Fini, Gianfranco Fini. And they are a neo-fascist party. They, in coalition with the Berlusconi, Forza Italia, and the Northern League, the three parties came to power last March. And a day or two after the elections, Fini, the leader of the neo-fascists, now in power, says Mussolini was the most outstanding statesman of the century. So you see that there is a continuity there, and it's thanks in large part to U.S. policies, because we were the dominant factor, even though the British were involved as junior partners, the French as junior partners, and so forth. And it's just fascinating to see how these movements developed, and the inspiration for the neo-Nazi movement in Germany in the 1990s are these old Nazi war criminals like Otto Rehmer and Christofson, and there are a lot of names of former SS people, war criminals, who either were never punished or were punished with a slap on the wrist, and who never changed their views. They are unrepentant old Nazis who are the inspiration to the younger generation today. And these are the people who, in conjunction with the skinheads, are firebombing the homes of Turks, of their cultural clubs, and killing dozens of people. So it's a really kind of complex but quite fascinating scene, and that's why I'm so interested in doing a book on it. In fact, it's well along.
Is your book going to include the bringing over into the United States a lot of these fascist Nazi emigres, and setting up organizations in conjunction with the Republican Party?
Oh yes. In fact, I didn't mention, but the overthrow of the elected Bulgarian government in 1990 was carried out on behalf of the Weyrich organization. I mentioned the Free Congress Foundation. That was carried out or led by Laszlo Pastor. And Laszlo Pastor is a Hungarian who was a youth leader in the most fanatical of the Hungarian Nazi organizations. It was called the Arrow Cross. And he was a convicted war criminal. He was, I think, sentenced to 2 years after the war. It was hardly a sentence because he was responsible for rounding up, he was involved in the rounding up of tens of thousands of Jews to send to the extermination camps. This is during the 40s, before the end of the war, while Hungary still had this Nazi regime under Admiral Horthy. But now the Horthy regime has been rehabilitated in Hungary. But Pastor is the man who was one of the major leaders of the Republican ethnic electoral organizations. And they went into the communities where there were people from Eastern Europe and their clubs and so forth, you know, in the Middle West and here and there. And this ethnic nationalities organization, the Republican Party, was chock-a-block with fascists and Nazis from that period in Eastern Europe. They brought them over here. But they brought them over here for different reasons. The Apollo moon landing was engineered and organized and made possible through Nazi war criminals, like Werner von Braun. These people who came over and ran the Apollo program, in fact, ran the whole United States rocket program from 45 on, had run the underground factory for the V-2 rockets. And it was in an old salt mine, which had been dug out much larger. And there they created this underground factory that was invulnerable to bombing. And alongside it, they established a work camp called Dora. It was a concentration camp. And over a period of about 2 years, I think the figure is around 35 or 40,000 people who died as slave laborers to make the factory and then to be the workers in the factory. And these men were responsible for that. And they were brought by the United States over to this country and put in the same work here. And Arthur Rudolph, for example, was one of the principals, along with von Braun. And they eventually deported him back to Germany. And they'd all become U.S. citizens. Several died, von Braun died, but Rudolph lived on slightly long enough to be deported. And he renounced his U.S. citizenship in the U.S. Consulate General in Hamburg, where I live. So you had them coming back. You had Project Paperclip, for example. There was a mad rush for the German technology because it was so much further advanced than the United States or Britain.
Paperclip was the code name for bringing
code name was for yes, they had these teams of army people who knew just where they were going to go, and they knew who to look for, and they'd made this study all through the war. And so they had targets here, there, and everywhere. And they were rushing to get these people before the Soviets got them. And so it was a mad scene at the end of the war and the months afterwards, because they were grabbing these people and bringing them back as fast as they could. And they didn't care whether they were war criminals or whatever they did. They gave them new names in certain cases, were the worst cases, and they protected them. They violated U.S. law right and left, bringing these people back. But that was the day. I mean, that was the scene then. And, you know, it's no different from today. Who follows the law today in these things?
Yeah.
And so that's why it's so important for people to be involved in groups, the group of choice. And there are many activities out there to be engaged in, such as Solidarity with Cuba to try to break down that blockade of 35 years, or with Guatemala. So there is something out there for everyone, and we only have ourselves to blame if we don't take action now. Because with the huge growth of the extreme right in the United States, now with the militia movement and the Christian Patriot movement, the whole paramilitary culture, these are the potential brown shirts of the future, in my opinion. And the same exists in Europe, where the electoral parties are doing very well in France and in Austria and in Italy and in Belgium and in Norway. But here in the United States, these extremist parties are not, but the Christian right, which is extremist in my opinion, and they want to impose their own concept of morality on all the rest of us through civil law and so forth, you know that. They have taken over the control of the state Republican Party apparatus in between 20 and 30 states. And they are determined, they've said it just straight up front, we are going to take control of the Republican Party by the year 2000. This is Pat Robertson's group. But there are many others who are even worse than that. The country is peppered with these extremist organizations, and all they're lacking, really, is a charismatic leader. And there's one out there, I'm sure. So we'll only have ourselves to blame if one day there's a knock on the door and they're coming for us, because we didn't take the opportunity when it was there to make sure they never could do that. Was, in its most important parts, spying on allies. And the State Department was supposed to get this type of information. The CIA would get it in its way, secretly, or through some kind of technical means, or through agents. And so I just point that document out. That's 20 years ago, and they were doing it for 20 years before that.
I would assume then they would turn this information over to the corporations, the multinational corporations?
That I can't be sure of. They would send it in, of course, to the analysts, and they would then be preparing reports for use within the government, in the Commerce Department, you know, and within the White House and the National Security Council and its staff. But the decision to turn it over to commercial companies or multinationals is something which I can't really say that they did that then, but we did help the multinationals in different ways from time to time. My very first job in the CIA after the training program was I was assigned to the Latin American division, to the Venezuela desk, and my job, it was so boring. I had to do name checks, and a name check is where you get a name from, in this case, Caracas, our office in Caracas in the embassy. And you make a request for all the records on this particular person from the Records Integration Division, or RID. That's where the files were. And then you were looking for anything negative, politically negative, in other words, or derogatory. It happened that these lists of names that I was getting every week were given to us in Caracas by the Chief of Security of Creole Petroleum.
Oh.
And Creole Petroleum, you know, was the largest overseas subsidiary of Esso, or now Exxon, of Standard Oil of New Jersey, in other words. And so we were performing this security check in order to help them keep political undesirables out of employment because these were people who were prospective employees for Creole. And so we were doing these checks on Venezuelans, actually, and serving the interests of this enormous Standard Oil, Exxon, Esso subsidiary abroad. This is one example, and I can tell you, when I got out of that job, I was very happy, because it's just boring, as you can imagine, to try to go through all these different records and look for something that might be derogatory and then have to write it back. And the first name I got was Jose Diaz, and didn't even have a date of birth. So you can imagine how many files I had on Jose Diaz. It's the most common
like
name
John
in
Smith.
life. Of course, yeah. It was
Well, this is when they say they're going to start doing economic intelligence now and helping out the quote U.S. unquote corporations. They've really been doing that all along. It's just kind of taking the mask off of it, because everywhere they have, the CIA has actually been making that particular country safe.
20 years, and then 20 years before that. But one area that ought not to be forgotten is Cuba, because there is a 35-year economic blockade going against Cuba still. And there are those people who are trying to intensify this and broaden it still more now. The CIA, without the slightest doubt, has the requirement in every country to report on any possible trade deals that Cuba may be interested in making, or investment in Cuba now that the country has opened up. And the CIA has got to collect this information so that measures can be taken to sabotage these possible deals of interest and benefit to Cuba. I was there last year, and I was in a meeting being addressed by Roberto Robaina. He is the foreign minister, very young, hip guy. And he was telling us that of every 10 possible deals they have for investment in Cuba or for trade, and the United States is able to squash 9. And so they know perfectly well that every move they make as they go around the world in trade negotiations or in seeking investment for whatever in Cuba, they are being followed and watched under a microscope, so that some measure can be taken. It could be the ambassador with the local government. It could be any way they can approach the person and put the pressure on. There's a good example of this, for example. The Soviets built a large petroleum refinery very near Cienfuegos, which is the main city on the south coast. This was never put into operation before the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then there was a diminution in trade, and the Cubans finally convinced or made a deal with the Ecuadorians, which are one of the principal exporting countries, and they were to bring the petroleum from Ecuador to Cuba to this refinery, refine the products, and re-export, leaving behind a certain amount of production to pay for the use of the refinery. This was going to be a great deal for Cuba, because they have an energy crisis that's terrible. The United States was able to put the fist down on Ecuador, and it fell through. So the Cubans made a deal with the Venezuelans, because eventually, you know, they nationalized Creole, and it's all a national industry now. The Venezuelans then were going to bring the petroleum to this refinery and re-export, leaving surplus production behind for the Cubans. The same thing happened. Bang. The Venezuelans had to withdraw. So the Cubans went to the Mexicans, and the Mexicans resisted. And now they are putting it into operation. So it's not hopeless, but you see how the United States is going around in these areas of economics and of trade and of commerce and finance to try to make the Cuban people suffer as much as they can. And this is affecting, in a drastic way, very young children and infants, and also the older, in other words, the most vulnerable. And it is an eternal shame on the United States, in my opinion, that we would do such a thing to an entire country, just because we don't like the system, just because they won't come under our protection, basically. It's a kind of a mafia attitude, and it has been that way since Eisenhower.
Well, that's capitalism.
Well, it's also the United States, and our tradition of being very nervous when we don't control something. And when a country like Cuba slips out from under our control, after we had ruled it practically as a neo-colony or a protectorate for 59 years or so, then it makes people nervous, because they know that if the Cubans are successful in their example of being able to provide, as a poor country, the best medical care in the third world to the whole population, because it's an inclusionary system. It's not like we have here, where you have this huge bulk of the population, you know, marginalized. But there, if everybody can have adequate medical care, if the schooling is adequate for all, and remember, Cuba has more doctors and more teachers per capita than any country in the world, and they have succeeded in these areas, and it's all state supported, which means people don't have to put money out for the medical care or for they of course pay the cost indirectly as a whole society, but they don't have to pay the bill in the hospital and so forth. And so that cannot be allowed to stand. It's a very bad example for the United States and for all the third world people in the United States. After all, we're becoming a third world country very fast, if not already, you know.
Not already, yeah.
And so there's a very large mass of people out there who can look at Cuba and say, well, if they can do it, and on a per capita income of $2,000, $2,500 a year, where ours is $22,500 a year, what's wrong with our system? I mean, maybe we ought to consider an alternative.
That's why Nicaragua, Sandinista Nicaragua, had to be destroyed.
Exactly. They were a bad example, and that's why Grenada had to be destroyed, because any movement that comes to power with the idea of providing for all the people and of escaping the control of the United States and its economy, let's say the corporations and so forth, then that is bad news here in the United States in the upper circles of power and influence. And so in Nicaragua, I watched it from the very beginning. I was often there, and it was a very sad sight to see the hopes at the beginning and the euphoria with the overthrow of this U.S. installed dictatorship from the 30s on, Somoza, and all the hopes for expanding education and the literacy program they adopted right at the beginning. It's similar to what the Cubans did.
Health as well.
Health as well, all of those things. Cuban doctors.
And profitable for the multinational corporations and local elites.
Yes, everything goes back to that. And as a matter of fact, this intervention abroad for stability, for the optimum operating conditions for U.S.-based multinationals is something that predates even certainly World War II. And in some respects, you could say it even predates the Bolshevik Revolution, because it's more than 100 years now that the leadership in this country has understood that there's no way to preserve the system in this country without foreign markets for surplus production, without foreign labor, cheap labor, and without the cheapest possible natural resources. And this is something which has been going on for 100 years, all through the Cold War. And so it is something that's going to continue for the future. But in this economic and commercial area, there have been two cases this year of operations that went bad. One was in France in February, when the French government caught the CIA trying to recruit people in the French government for secret information on French negotiating positions within the World Trade Organization context. And they ordered 5 CIA people out of the country. That was the news at that time in February. 4 of them, including the chief of station, were in the embassy undercover as diplomats, you know. And then there was a 5th one, a woman who was outside the embassy. She was under some non-official cover. I don't know what that was, but that was the news at that time. And then it comes out much later, just a few weeks ago, that as a result of this and of the reaction of the French government, the strong reaction to this attempt to penetrate their government, the whole CIA operation in Paris, in France, was shut down, including whatever they were doing against international terrorism, the narcotics trade, and so forth. That's one case that went bad on them this year. Another one that went bad just a few weeks ago was the leakage to the press, which was eventually confirmed. It's true. The CIA was spying on the Japanese negotiators last summer in the trade, the auto talks, you know, how we're trying to get into their market and so forth. And the CIA was monitoring the communications, I believe, of the Japanese negotiators and the appropriate ministry, and also the companies themselves, so that our side, that's the Mickey Cantor side, would have a better knowledge of what they would accept and what they wouldn't accept. And so this has soured relations with Japan also. So when you get into this area of spying on your allies, you're asking for a lot of trouble. And whether they give that to the companies or not, it's difficult to say. I can't tell you.
Of course, they've been doing this type, we talked about the Japanese, they've been doing that type of monitoring of communications and for years, for decades. This is nothing new. I guess it just now came out.
Yes, and as I mentioned, it goes back at least.
This is a program I've been wanting to do on alternative views for 17 years. And that is have an interview with former CIA officer Phil Agee. Now, we have had some programs with Phil that you have seen, some speeches that he has given that we've had copies of and have presented them to you, and on the documentary on company business. But this is our first chance to actually talk with him in person. Phil was in the CIA for 12 years and then quit after he saw what the CIA was actually doing, all the terrible things doing in the areas where he was working, particularly in Ecuador, Mexico, and Uruguay. He resigned in 1969 to write his first big book, Inside the Company, or CIA Diary. Since then, he's written 5 books, the last one being On the Run, which tells about his experiences after he got out of the CIA, when he was in Europe and trying to write his book, and the CIA was hounding him from country to country, doing everything it could to keep him from writing this book. Well, Phil, we're so pleased that you can finally be with us.
I'm very happy to be here. Very happy to be here.
You've had such an association with the CIA, both positive and negative, for so many years. Let's start out by talking about where the CIA is today. They say they want to do intelligence gathering on economic subjects rather than political, etc., like they have in the past. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that that's a normal activity. They've been doing that since the beginning. To speak of it as something new is really inaccurate. In this context of all this talk about economic and financial and commercial intelligence collection as a new role for the agency, I got out a document which was sent to me anonymously in 1976, 20 years ago practically. And this document was the list of the what they call key intelligence questions for 1975 in this very field: economic, commercial, financial intelligence, also high-tech developments, and all in the developed countries, all in allies like the NATO allies and Japan. And this was an innovation of William Colby when he came into the CIA in 1973. He tried to systematize and organize the foreign intelligence collection process. And for 1975, there were, I think, 69 key intelligence questions. And these are actually questions with some detail, and then there's a whole discussion of them that follows from 1 to 69. But these were only, on this document, they were only the 9 which deal with economic and commercial and financial matters. And I got that out, and it calls for great detail on all of these matters, including the negotiating positions, the fallback positions on such negotiations as the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, now the WTO, and all of it